I spent years trying to avoid rent court. I'd follow up with the tenant 20 times to get rent if I had to. I'd accept partial payments. If a tenant broke the lease or didn't pay, I'd look the other way as long as I got most of the money most of the time. I didn't want to go because I didn't know how to handle being in rent court. I'd never been. I didn't want to mess up. I didn't want to go there and lose. And now the tenant sort of knows that I don't know what I'm doing and they feel empowered. You always hear about the professional tenant that knows the system better than you do. It always seemed scary. And it just seemed like it was easier to wait and see if they paid by next Friday or if the never ending stream of crises that the tenants say that they're having finally stopped. All that changed one day when I found myself sitting in the rear pew of a courtroom. I was listening to a landlord get his case torn apart because he didn't have a rental license with him. I wasn't there because I had a case. I was just there to observe, like a field trip. I'm going to tell you what I learned and why you should go too. The advice to go to rent court came from one of my mentors, Dave Wandell. You don't need to schedule going to rent court. You don't need to be invited. You don't even have to have a case. You just find out when rent court is in your locale, and then you just show up on time, dress professionally, and just sit out of the way in the back to observe. I'd recommend that you get there early because otherwise you miss a key part of the experience. The first thing that you'll notice in rent court isn't actually in rent court itself. It's outside the courtroom when you're sitting waiting. And what you notice is that there's a panel of free lawyers there to help the tenants. The landlord doesn't get any free counsel, even though they're the one losing thousands of dollars and have this person living in their house for free. Now, personally, I don't hate the idea of tenants getting legal support because not all landlords are great, and I do think there's a place for that. But it is bizarre because these legal aids just sort of line up like a panel, and they're helping the person game the system. They're helping them figure out anything they can do to slow down the process, even though the vast majority of time, the situation is just that they're not paying. And if they haven't paid, they're basically holding somebody's house hostage. So I sat there with headphones on, but nothing playing. So I was pretending to be zoned out while I was actually doing is listening to the conversations around me. So basically, the legal aids coach the tenants. And the most common element of this is something called a rent escrow case. So for those that aren't familiar, a rent escrow case is when the tenant is essentially saying that the conditions of the property aren't suitable, and that's why they haven't been paying the rent. I would pay the rent if only the landlord would fix these conditions. And so what the judge says is, okay, well, you can put the money for rent into an escrow account with the court. Don't give it to the landlord. And only after they fix the issues will the money go to the landlord. So basically, because this is sort of one of the most effective ways of combating a rent court case, or a failure to pay rent as it's called, this is the main thing that the legal aids sort of recommend that the tenants try to go for. So they're sort of coaching them on, hey, is there anything in the property that you can say isn't in good condition, whether or not it's something that the landlord actually caused or not. So what's interesting about these rent escrow cases is that the tenant's actually supposed to pay the money into the escrow account, which means they have to actually have the money to pay the rent. And then they can go down this line of defense. But depending on the judge you have, they may not even make them put the money into the rent and escrow account. So that's why it's such an effective thing that tenants try to go for. I listened to all manner of these types of conversations before we finally came inside to the courts. I listened to the legal aids talking to them about all sorts of things. So we then come into the court, and they made us turn our phones off, and we sit down. It's very quiet. The judge has on robes and all this. It's fairly august. But then a judge sits down and explains the procedures and the cases begin. So over the next hour or so, I listened to many, many different scenarios and situations, but they began to take on a familiar feel. Someone hadn't paid, the landlord wanted them out, and the tenant felt that they should get to basically stay for free for whatever the reason was. It was one reason or another, they always felt they should be able to stay for free. And then the judge would decide if the landlord got the judgment today, that they had the rights to the house, or if the tenant got more time. That's the core of the whole dynamic. So I saw some landlords crush cases. Tenants would make the rent escrow request, and the landlord or their agent would whip out the maintenance logs and the receipts and show that they had actually gone in and fixed the issues as requested or attempted to, and maybe the tenant had denied them access to go in and fix the issue. In those situations, the landlords crushed the case, and they got the summary judgment, and that was sort of the end of it. It went on towards eviction. Then I saw other cases where the case didn't even get heard because the landlord didn't have the proper documents to have the case be heard. I watched one landlord fumble around for 5 or 6 minutes looking for a lead cert, but which never turned up. So who knows if he actually had one or not. But in any event, his case got delayed because he couldn't bring it up that day. I saw tenants not show up to cases and even landlords not show up while the other party was there and wondering what was going on. The main observation for me was that the landlords or the agents that had all their documents in one place, organized, and explained the situation clearly did the best. Simply by being prepared, they won their motions and didn't get bogged down in the soup put together by the legal aids. Outside of that, I got a few very specific pieces of information too. For example, in my market, you have to show that the tenant is not in the armed forces. The main idea is they don't want to evict a soldier who's deployed or something like that. So if the tenant's there, the judge will just ask them if they're in the armed forces. And under oath, they have to basically say that they're not, and you move on. But if they're not there, the judge will actually require you to produce a document that shows that you tried to search to see if the tenant was in the armed forces. So if your tenant doesn't show up, you'd think, okay, I need less documents. But actually, if your tenant doesn't show up, you need more documents. So that small tidbit lost some landlords their cases. And that's the type of thing you only learn by watching other people lose. So that's why I would suggest don't just watch this video. Actually try to go do this in your own market so you can see the types of pitfalls that people fall into. I learned a bunch about how to navigate rent court, but the most important lesson that I learned in rent court was not to be afraid of rent court. It's just a process. It's a process that I could prepare for and be ready to succeed in, have all my documents ready, and make sure that I've been compliant up to that point. And if I did that, then I would be in a better situation. I didn't have to pay these people to leave my property when they're the one doing something wrong. I didn't have to accept them violating my lease and almost nearly beg them to pay. I could just take them to rent court, follow the process, and enforce my rights. But that day sitting there, I also realized that not only was rent court not scary, it was also necessary. And that's why I would recommend that every newer landlord go. When you're afraid of rent court and the tenant court in general and evictions in general, you're afraid to enforce your lease. You accept things from the tenants that you shouldn't accept that actually make you operate your property more poorly and create a worse situation for your business and ultimately a negative situation for the tenant as well. By demystifying rent court, I became more confident to enforce the payment terms, the late fees, and lease violations, and all the other components of my lease that I should have been enforcing all of this time. These items help the tenants not get as far behind and also reduces the amount of time and hassle that I have to go through enforcing the lease and just trying to manage the business. It makes you a stronger professional and lets you hold your ground when speaking with a disruptive tenant instead of sort of talking a big game, but basically every time they say, I'll have the money in a couple days, you sort of wobble and hope that they have it and don't want to proceed forward with the filing. So when my turn came finally in rent court, I spoke clearly, I provided my documentation, and I won my judgment. Around 30 days later, I got my house back. I turned it over and rented to a better tenant that pays on time. I turned a problem property into a property with a good tenant that pays on time. If I had just wandered in from the start, I probably would have lost in any of the myriad ways that I saw people lose that day. So instead, I came early, I learned from others, and so far, I'm undefeated in rent court.